中山先生。
どうも、はじめまして。今日はありがとうございます。
いえ、こちらこそよろしくお願いします。
Good evening, everybody. ありがとうございます。
こちらこそ。
Great, a very warm welcome everyone to this event on the recently published book by Professor Daisaku Higashi entitled Inclusivity, Mediation and Peacebuilding, UN, Neighboring States and Global Powers. I should say at the outset that this event is being recorded. And my name is Andres Hereblinger. I'm a senior researcher here at the Center on Conflict Development and Peacebuilding at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies. Let me first introduce our main speakers and welcoming him to this event. Professor Daisaku Higashi is professor at Sophia University in Tokyo. He holds a PhD from the University of British Columbia in Canada, and he has a very multifaceted and impressive career because he started his career as a program director at a Japan public TV station, producing numerous documentaries, including one entitled Rebuilding Iraq, Challenges of the UN. But he also worked for the UN Assistance Mission in Afghanistan as a minister counselor for the permanent mission of Japan to the UN, and has conducted several missions to Iraq and South Sudan to advise the Japanese Foreign Ministry on peacebuilding aspects. He is a renowned expert on mediation and peacebuilding, which shows, of course, in his most recent book that we are discussing today. I should also say that the book was published in the Academic Council on the UN System book series, the ACUNS book series, and is based on impressive field research in Afghanistan, South Sudan, Syria, Yemen, Iraq, and East Timor. And again, we are very happy to have Professor Daisaku Higashi present the book to us here today. In terms of structure of this event, Professor Daisaku Higashi will present the book first, and we then have two distinguished discussants to present some comments before we will have time for questions and discussions. The first discussant is Professor Sukehiro Hazakawa, who is the former special representative of the Secretary General for East Timor and the president of the Global Peacebuilding Association of Japan. He has an impressive career both academically and as a practitioner. Important positions he held in the past include his role as Deputy Resident Representative of UNDP in Nepal and Indonesia, Deputy Executive Coordinator of the UN Volunteers Program, Director of Policy and Planning of the UN Peacekeeping Operation in Somalia, UN Resident and Humanitarian Coordinator in Rwanda, and Deputy Assistant Administrator and Deputy Regional Director for Asia and the Pacific of UNDP in New York. He played a particularly important role in East Timor as Special Representative of the Secretary General, but also as head of the UN office in East Timor, and later as Special Advisor to both the President and the Prime Minister. He has also taught at several universities and is a key figure in the peacebuilding field. And thank you very much for being here with us today, Professor Hazakawa. As a second discussant, we have Dr. Andres Hereblinger. He's an expert on peace processes at the Center on Conflict Development and Peacebuilding here at the Graduate Institute. He's particularly known for his research on knowledge production, inclusion in peace processes, and the increasing use of digital technologies by conflict parties and peacemakers. And I recommend to look up his publications because they are really groundbreaking. He has extensive expertise and experience on peace processes in the Horn of Africa and particularly on South Sudan. He's currently leading a research project looking at how digital technology helps or hinders dealing with uncertainties in mediation processes. And this is particularly novel and innovative, how artificial intelligence could be used in mediation processes. So we have an excellent lineup of speaker and then discussants here today. And without any further ado, I would now like to give the floor to Professor Daisaku Higashi for the presentation of his book. Daisaku, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I really appreciate that Sarah made a lot of commitment to host this special session for me. So I really appreciate you and also Grady Institute, which gave me this precious opportunity. I also appreciate Andreas and also Professor Hazakawa to become a commentator for today. Because there is time limit and I will do my best to finish my presentation by 35 minutes, let me start it. So today I'd like to make basically 3 steps argument that I presented in my book. The second is like some key feature of my case studies, like South Sudan, Afghanistan, Syria. And also in the last, I'd like to mention some implication of the book on the Ukraine conflict. And maybe there might be some doubt that when we are so forced to have a huge attention on Ukraine war, why we need to discuss those issues now. And I thought by myself, maybe there might be 2 key reasons. The other conflicts and suffering of the people are not erased by the Russian invasion to Ukraine. So they continue to have suffering. So it's still important for us to keep thinking about how to solve those problems. The second, I believe that the lesson from the past conflict resolutions have still some important implications on how to end the Ukraine war. Let me start my introduction. I start, as Sarah kindly mentions, I started my career as a program director for NHK, Japan Public TV stations, and I made a lot of documentary on like a Vietnam War, Middle East peace talk, North Korea nuclear issues, and the Rebuilding Iraq Challenge of the United Nations, which I got the silver medal from US Correspondent Association in 2004. And then I quitted my job to start my master and PhD in the political science at the University of British Columbia in Canada. I conducted my field research in Afghanistan and Timor in 2008, and I worked as a team leader for reconciliation and integration in UNAMA for 1 year in Kabul. Then I got a position as associate professor at the University of Tokyo, and I completed my PhD from UBC in Canada. And I was appointed to the Minister Council in the Japanese mission to the United Nations as an exchange program between the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the universities. So I directed the Japanese team on the Peacebuilding Commission as also mediation issue in New York on the United Nations. After I returned to the universities, I was invited to the 10-year position at Sophia University in Tokyo in 2016. And I continued to do my research like South Sudan, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Afghanistan, East Timor. And in 2015, I published my first English book, Challenge of Constructing Legitimacy in Peace Buildings. And in this particular book, I presented my own argument about how legitimate government can be constructed in the post-conflict peace building settings. A legitimate government as a government which have kind of legitimacy to pull the compliance in a voluntary mode, so that majority of the people will comply with the rule or order of the government. And then maybe there are 4 key factors in terms, according to my argument. One is credible third parties, because there's a kind of mistrust between the conflicting party in the post-conflict settings. And although United Nations is not perfect, United Nations still seems to have some credibility as a credible third parties, compared with like a powerful state or a global powerful state. The second is it's very vital to have kind of inclusive political processes. If you have a political exclusions against some specific groups, they tend to go back to the military conflict or civil wars. Third, we need to have a resource distribution. It's about how to improve living conditions of the peoples, and also like a level of forces. I mean, like military and the police. And if we have those key 4 factors, we tend to have a compliance to like a result of the election, constitutional mobilizations. And if we have a repeated compliance, maybe we tend to have a legitimate government in the long run. But if we have a repeated non-compliance or rejections, the government will be eroded. And I argue that the Iraq and Afghanistan seems to go into this path because of the political exclusion. For example, in Afghanistan, political exclusion against the Taliban. But in the East Timor and Sierra Leone, it tend to go to these directions. And as you know, in the last years, the Afghan government actually was collapsed. And when I published this book, I got many questions that, yes, we understand the importance of the importance of the political inclusiveness, but when local leaders do not embrace it or support it, how we should do it. So in order to pursue that question, I applied to the grant for scientific research in Japan on peace building and political exclusions, and I got it for 3 years. And then I got another one by peace building and political parties, which still continue right now. And I just published this book, Inclusivity, Mediation, Peacebuildings, from Edward Elgar as an ACUNS series on UN system, based on my field research on like South Sudan, Afghanistan, Syria, Yemen, Iraq, and Timor-Leste. And I'm very happy that Graduate Institute, which is one of the most famous universities in the world, give us an opportunity to share my book. And in this particular book, I present one of the key arguments in the book. It's that, I argue that the nature of inclusivity in the mediation during armed conflict, I mean, still they are fighting, and the nature of the inclusivity in the post-conflict peace building are fundamentally different. In terms of the post-conflict peace building, yes, inclusivity or avoiding political exclusion is very key to success of making kind of sustainable peace. But in terms of in mediation during armed conflict, when people are still fighting, like a conflict in the Ukraine right now, inclusivity actually needs to be very flexible in order to reach a peace agreement. We cannot have a dogmatic idea that it's better just to have more and more parties in the peace negotiation phases. You might need to have some, realistic approach on that. So inclusivity or question of the inclusivity need to be very flexible in the phase of the mediation during armed conflict. In terms of the leading international actors, yes, in terms of post-conflict peace building, I still argue the United Nations should play a central role, because if global powers like the United States and other countries try to play a central role in rebuilding or making a new state, it could be seen as like a new colonialism. So it's still better for the nation to play a central role. Of course, this proposition might be seriously damaged by this Russian invasion to the Ukraine. So this is something that we can discuss. But in terms of the mediation during armed conflict, it's a little bit difficult to expect too much for the United Nations. Actually, it's the global powers and the neighboring state which have a primary responsibilities to end the conflict. In many cases, global power and the neighboring state just requested or support ostensibly the UN effort on the mediation, but actually they might keep supporting a conflicting party on the grounds. And in this case, it's very difficult to stop the fighting. So I argue that there's some limit of the nation when the global power and neighboring states are divided. So it's very important for them to become united to end the war by persuading the conflict parties in the countries. So those are my key arguments in this particular book. And in chapter 2, I introduce some academic debate and also UN document. There seems consensus on the importance of inclusivity on post-conflict peace buildings. For example, Charles Cole published a book, Why Peace Fails, in 2012, and the political exclusion, rather than economic or social factor, plays a decisive role in most cases of civil war recurrence. This is what he concluded. And I also made a kind of same argument by doing a kind of and Charles Cole used a lot of statistical analysis. I made a case study analysis to show kind of same thing in my previous book. And the UN Secretary General report also emphasized that there are 3 key factors in the success of the peace building. One is inclusivity, second is institutional building, and the third is the mutual accountabilities. And finally, in 2016, UN General Assembly and the UN Security Council adopted kind of twin resolutions. and on peace building. And in this resolution, there's a sentence that inclusivity is key to advancing national peace building processes. So it became kind of consensus, at least in the paper in the United Nations. But in terms of the inclusivity in the mediation during armed conflict, it's very controversial. For example, Cunningham in 2006 argued it's critical to reduce the number of the veto players in peace negotiation to achieve peace agreement. On the other hand, like Vanis St. John and Nilsson argued that more civil society are involved in the negotiation, it's more likely that peace will be sustained. But they also admit that there's a kind of risk that peace agreement might not be achieved in the first place if there are too many parties. So there's a kind of dilemma of the inclusivity in mediation during armed conflict, according to those academics' argument. And I also engage with kind of negotiation on the resolution of the UN General Assembly on the mediations in 2014. And actually proposed, based on my academic kind of expertise, I propose the sentences that inclusivity or emphasize importance of the inclusivity in the implementation of the agreed outcome of a mediation process. So basically it's about after mediation or peace agreement. So it's about peace building or importance of the inclusivity in the peace building phases. But there are some European countries which wanted to have language to emphasize the importance of inclusivity in both mediation and also in the post-conflict peace buildings. But there's substantial numbers of positions against inclusivity in the mediation because we need to have some flexibilities. And I think it's reflected by the reality on the ground. So in the end of the day, at least we concluded that we can have a consensus on this language, inclusive, emphasize the importance of inclusive national processes in the implementation of the agreed outcome of mediation process. So it's about basically it's post-conflict peace building. So I argue, based on those academic debate and also UN document, I argue that we need to have some flexible approaches depending on the different circumstances. For instance, the first negotiation would be one between the most influential parties, between two most influential parties, and extend agreement to larger groups in some cases. In another case, it might be different, but this is one of the possibilities. Or you might have some two layers of the negotiation, one by core group or one by larger groups. And I think there are many researchers at the Graduate Institute which explore those kind of possibilities. So I really respect those kind of research. And I think South Sudan case represents some kind of important suggestion for this particular argument. This is South Sudan's. As you know, South Sudan became independent after 50 years war against Sudan. But only 2 years after, Riek Machar, Vice President of South Sudan, was fired by President Salva Kiir. So inclusive national political process was collapsed. And in December 2013, civil war actually started. There's a peace agreement between the President Kiir and Riek Machar in August 2015. And in April 2016, Riek Machar returned to Juba and the transitional government was established. But only 3 months later, military clash started again. So there's a political and military rivalry between the President Kiir and the Vice President Machar, and the Kiir represent kind of Dinka, the biggest tribe, and the Machar represent Nuer tribe, which is the second biggest tribe. So because of the ongoing conflict, I was not able to enter South Sudan at first. So I started my research in like a neighboring country like Ethiopia, Kenya, and Uganda in 2016, 17, and 18. And I, for example, interviewed like a South Sudan ambassador to AU in Ethiopia, and also Peter Adwak, the former Minister of Higher Education, who was an advisor to Riek Machar. I also interviewed many negotiator or mediator, including IGAD, East African Regional Organization, which mediated the conflict in South Sudan, and also UN Special Envoy for South Sudan and Sudan, like Nicholas Haysom. Now he became SRG for UNMISS. I also went to Uganda to interview many South Sudanese refugees coming from South Sudan almost every day. We got about 200, 300 refugees coming out of the South Sudan to the Uganda in these years. So it was very shocking to interview and to hear their stories. Finally, in March in 2019, I was assigned by Japanese Foreign Minister to go to South Sudan to make some contribution to peace building in 2019. Partially because there was a peace agreement in September 2018. So that's why it's become possible for me to go there. So I interviewed first Vice President of South Sudan, like a Taban Dengai, Minister in Cabinet Affairs, Minister of Higher Education, the person who steers national dialogue, a head of the UN mission in South Sudan, and also IGAD Special Envoy for South Sudan, to capture what happened in the peace negotiation on South Sudan. I also made a lecture in the Juba University together with like 200 students who also became who used to be like a refugee. I also went to JICA construction Freedom Bridge site. I think it will be completed this year. And I also went to the JICA, Japan International Cooperation project to create a water system in Juba, which cover almost 40% of the population in the Juba in the futures. And actually, in terms of peace negotiation in South Sudan, there's a revitalized peace process for South Sudan, which started in December 2017, together with factions of President Kiir, Vice President, and also almost 20 political groups. IGAD, which steered or facilitated negotiation, had a serious lesson from the previous failure in 2015 negotiation. So they wanted to have an inclusive process. So they invited almost like a 22 political group into peace negotiation. So it was good to try to make that kind of process, but in the reality, there is no sight. There's no sight in having any peace agreement by a series of the negotiation by those 20 groups on South Sudan, which was happened or which was conducted in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. So in the end of the day, the president of the country in IGAD, like a president of the Uganda, Kenya, Ethiopia, and Sudan, decided to have bilateral meeting between the President Kiir and Machar, which the Prime Minister Abiy of Ethiopia invited in June 2018. But still, they could not reach to any agreement. They said, oh, we cannot work together anymore. We have a very big mistrust or even the hatred each other. So Abiy gave up, and he requested Mr. Bashir, the president of Sudan at that time, to make a mediation. And actually, Bashir accepted. One of the reasons is that South Sudan produce a lot of oil, and the Sudan will get a lot of money by giving like oil pipeline to the South Sudan. But because of the conflict in South Sudan, this revenue was stopped. So there's economic incentive. And also President Bashir wanted to show that he's a person, a politician who can make a peace as well. So he accepted, and he had a leverage for the Vice President Machar because he supported Machar for many, many years. But he did not have any leverage against the President Kiir, but he requested Museveni, President of Uganda, to come to the Khartoum, capital of Sudan, together with Kiir, President Kiir, because it was the President of Uganda which supported President Kiir for many, many years. So he had the biggest leverage against the President Kiir. So in the end of the day, in July 2018, those four key actors had a very intensive negotiation for almost 2 weeks, and they created kind of basic agreement. And then they approached to the another 20 political groups again, and they got that comprehensive peace agreement, which was signed in September 2018. So that was the kind of dynamics of making a comprehensive peace negotiation for South Sudan in 2018. And there's kind of fragility of implementation of the peace process. But at least in February 2020, the revitalized transitional government national unity was established with the return of the Mr. Machar to Juba as first vice president in February 2020. And this was a very typical power sharing agreement. So 20 cabinet members, for example, are appointed by President Kiir, 9 cabinet members are appointed by Machar, and the 6 appointed by other groups. But at least this 2018 peace agreement has still been maintained, even though there are many fragilities. So there's some critique by United States and some European countries that this peace negotiation, peace process cannot be accepted because it was not inclusive. But I think it was a little bit too dogmatic. We need to accept some flexibility of making a peace agreement first. Of course, in the face of the peace building, it's very crucial not to have a political exclusion against some specific political groups. So I think this is the next challenge for the South Sudan. So I will actually host the symposium on South Sudan peace building in 2 weeks, 20 April 2022, by online, having like a Tabandan guy and also Deputy Special Envoy, or Deputy Special Representative Secretary General for the South Sudan, together with like a JICA representative and Japanese ambassador. So if you're interested, you are very welcome to come as well, because it's very rare to know what is happening on South Sudan. So I think it's very important for us to keep having some attention. Chapter 4 examine the case of Afghanistan. And as you know, the peace nation building started in 2002, but there's no effort to include the Taliban into the nation building process. In 2010, I worked for UNAMA as a team leader for reconciliation, and we supported the Afghan government to establish some kind of a mechanism to start negotiation with the Taliban. But unfortunately, there is no sustainable talk between the Taliban and the government, or Taliban and the United States, until October 2018. So in the end of the day, Taliban decided to request the United States to have a bilateral negotiations. And the United States, I mean, President Trump accepted that offer because he's a little bit, he doesn't follow so very normal procedure. He said, if the Taliban really want to talk with the United States, why you don't talk? So there's this kind of bilateral negotiations between the United States and Taliban, which was hosted by Qatar for many rounds. And after almost 10 rounds of the talk, sustainable talk between the United States and Taliban, there was a deal between the United States and Taliban in February 2020. United States will withdraw its forces by 14 months, which is May 2021. And Taliban will do its best to not allow that international terrorist group to be operated in Afghanistan. So that was a basic deal. And based on that deal, the Afghan government Taliban started the peace negotiation in September 2020. So this was that meeting hosted by Qatar. So I thought that it's a very important year for Afghan peace process. So I hosted the series of seminar Afghan peace process starting from last January 2021, together with Nadia Naim, former vice chair of High Peace Council. And also I invited Peter Du, my friend, very close friend, who is a director at the UN headquarters in charge of Afghanistan, and also Mr. Tsuji, director in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Japan. Together with like 300 participants. So I hosted the second seminar together with Habiba Sarabi, who was a female member in Afghan government negotiation team, which had a negotiation with the Taliban at that time. Together with like UNAMA directors and also Director General in Middle East in Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Japan. So, and the Nadia Naim, together with Nadia Naim. So Nadia Naim wanted to have a more and more seminar to get attention about peace process. So we negotiated Abdal, number 2 in the Afghan government at that time, and the head of the Afghan government negotiation team, to have the third seminar, and he accepted the kind of keynote speech. But in the process of arranging the date and time, Afghan government actually was collapsed on August 15, 2021. So there's no doubt that the peace process was failed. But at least the constant dialogue between the Abdal and the Taliban in Doha had some role in avoiding all-out war in Kabul in the last part of the war in Afghanistan. But unfortunately, after Taliban captured entire countries, there's a huge economic and also humanitarian crisis because of the kind of sanction which the United States started against the Afghanistan. So when David Beasley, top of the visited Kabul on November last year, he said, now we are looking at 23 million people marching towards starvation. We have only 40 million people in Afghanistan, but the 23 million people marching towards starvation. And a few million people actually die by malnutrition in 6 months because of the man-made policy, according to him. Man-made policy means an economic sanctions. So I continue to argue in the media and also for the political leader in Japan that there's a kind of contradiction of this financial sanction against Afghanistan. United States froze the banking system. I mean, they froze $7 billion US dollar asset of Afghan central bank to pressure the Taliban to obtain or maintain human rights and counter terrorism. But first, the blanket financial sanctions can result in the death of the millions of the Afghan vulnerable and innocent people, overwhelming women, children, the exact people that the sanction is actually aimed to protect. So there are a lot of critique, even by the US media, starting from last October, including like a New York Times, is the United States driving Afghanistan toward famine, and MSNBC, again, New York Times. Many media started to argue against that it's a contradictory. It's also a contradiction in terms of the counter-terrorism activities, because if the Taliban is collapsed by the sanction, Afghanistan will enter the civil war again, and we are all quite sure that it's ISIS-K, Islamic State, Khorasan State, which will gain more territory and power. So it's a worst-case scenario for Afghan people inside living Afghanistan, and also United States and the world for even counter-terrorism policy. So I argue that it's very important to at least normalize economies. And the Japanese NGO at least started their activities in Afghanistan. One of them is a Peace Medical Service, which was headed by very famous Dr. Tetsu Nakamura, who worked for Afghanistan for 35 years. And he started the delegation in Afghanistan 20 years ago, together with many Afghan farmers. And he used local technique and labor-intensive work to create canals for the irrigation like this by using Japanese traditional technologies. So he created a lot of canals like this coming from the big rivers, like canal rivers. So this is a place which used to be agricultural field, but it became desert because of the global warmings. But 10 years later, those places become very agricultural field because of the canal and irrigations. This is another deserted field, but 5 years later it become like this with the green and the agriculture. So there are many villages which were revived by this canaling system. So they created 16,500 hectares agricultural field. They revived 16,500 hectares, and also 650,000 farmers actually living in that field right now. And there's a plan with JICA and FAO to expand this irrigation system to entire Afghanistan. But this one was frozen because of the Taliban takeover the country. But I argue that it's very important to resume it because it's very crucial for Afghan people to start having a livelihood. So I had a chance to make a lecture for Japanese Parliament Working Group on populations, which is very 40 years tradition and the history and the legitimacies. And I presented this 5 policy proposals. One is to increase the humanitarian assistance as much as possible. And second, because to maintain the life of Afghan people at least, and support Japanese NGO together with the United Nations, which began their operation with after the agreement of the Taliban. There are almost 9 Japanese NGOs which started resumed the operation in Afghanistan after getting some kind of agreement with the Taliban. It's also important to define the humanitarian assistance very broadly so that it can support not only distribution of the medicine and the food, but also educational and agricultural sectors. It's very important to give general advice to the United States that it's very contradictory to keep this financial sanction. So it's better to remove the financial sanction at least against entire Afghan government. You might want to keep some targeted sanction that the United Nations imposed on some Taliban individual, but it's an entirely different thing to have a blanket financial sanctions against Afghan peoples. Number 5, it might be important for Japan to host kind of international conference on humanitarian assistance and also normalization of the economy for the Afghan people in the late 2020 or 2023. So the working group, this parliament group working group forwarded my 5 proposals to Mr. Hayashi, Minister of Foreign Affairs, on 23rd December 2021, I mean last year, and I accompanied the meeting to explain the detail of the proposals. Although still the stage economic and financial and also humanitarian situation in Afghanistan is very difficult and dire, there's one good news. Mr. Nadia Naim, who was my counterpartner, became very interested in the irrigation project by PMS because I shared the information. So he created Afghan-led consortium, Afghan NGO named Afghan Relief Assistance Partnership in the end of 2021, together with Miss Seraj, a very famous Afghan female journalist. And he actually met Afghan representative of the PMS, this Japanese NGO in Kabul, and he went to irrigation site just 2 weeks ago. And they decided to work together to expand this PMS irrigation system, because we already have a textbook on this system with Dari and the Pashtun version. So this is one of the I think an important step that Afghan people or Afghan civil society started having some network to expand this kind of very important and valuable irrigation system, because 90% of Afghan people are actually farmers. So it's very important for them to have their own livelihood. So I need to finish this presentation maybe in the next 3 minutes. So let me go to very quickly, but I also examine the case of Syria and Yemen, which represent that when global power and neighboring states are divided, it's very difficult for a nation to achieve any peace agreement. So in terms of Syria, as you know, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, Turkey supported opposition. Iran and Russia have supported the Assad regime, and Russia actually started military intervention in September 2015, huge military intervention. So in 2015, 1/3 of the territory was controlled by the Afghan, Assad government, like a red one, and the opposition controlled 1/3, and the ISIS controlled 1/3. But because of the Russian military interventions, Assad regime really expanded their territory like this. So when I did my research in Geneva and interviewed Staffan de Mistura, he said that I'm not naive, that there might be possibility of the military end. But if there's no political solution, maybe chronic insurgency would continue. And I think his prediction was right. But this logic did not persuade Assad to stop the fighting. So actually now Assad government controls almost 70% of the territory. And the normal opposition control a very small, tight area of the Idlib now in the Syria. I also examine Iraqi and East Timor cases to show that inclusive political process is very crucial, both in success and the failure of the peace building. In terms of Iraq, I was assigned by the foreign minister to go to Iraq in 2018 and 19 to interview like 3 vice presidents and have a lot of discussion with former prime ministers, and also have a discussion with a professor in Baghdad universities. But as you know, there are a lot of civil war, 2 big civil war in Iraq after US invaded Iraq in 2003. So this shows how it was difficult to make a nation building when they excluded kind of basically Sunni political factions. The contradiction, there's a big contrast in the East Timor in which Shalana Guzman and Maru Al-Khatiri, two big fathers of the East Timor state, used to have a kind of political rivalry, but they transformed their relationship into the collaboration and the reconciliations. And Mr. Hazakawa, actually, today's commentator, actually made a huge role in facilitating their relationships. And I also had a chance to go to the East Timor in 2017 together with 13 students, have a lot discussion with those two leaders. And Shalana Guzman, the former president, also prime minister, really emphasized the importance of the inclusivity. That was very inclusive process. That was quite interesting. So let me finish my presentation by saying implication of my book on the Ukraine conflict. It's so difficult, even for global power, to establish new or puppet government by having military intervention, which was suggested by Soviet intervention or invasion to Afghanistan in 1979, United States military attack against Afghanistan in 2001, and also United States military inclusion to Iraq in 2003. But Russia might have some wrong lesson from its experience in Syria and also Georgia in 2008 and Crimea in 2014. But I think it became almost clear that it's very impossible for the Russians to make a puppet government in Ukraine. But at the same time, they might try to consolidate some territory in the Donbas area, so the conflict might be lost. So it's true that China has the biggest leverage on Russia because of the sanction by the West country against Russia. So it's better to frame it not the conflict between the democratic state and non-democratic state, but it's better to frame it as a conflict or country which comply with the basic rules versus the country which does not or do not. So if we frame it in this way, I think China also might want to persuade, even internally, the President Putin to withdraw the US, Russian forces from the Ukraine. This is my temporary idea. In my last chapter of the book, I also wrote that biggest challenge for UN peace operation for the future is whether or not the United States and the West democratic state and China and Russia, non-democratic state, can maintain some level of the cooperation on UN peacekeeping operation and peace buildings. Of course, this Ukraine conflict will certainly make it more difficult for UN Security Council to make collaborations on managing military conflict. But if that's the case, what could be the new systems? So this is something that I also want to discuss with you today. So thank you very much for your listening to my presentations, and I will get the floor back to Sarah. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Daisaku, for your presentation. I would now like to give the floor to Professor Sukehiro Hazakawa for some comments. You will need to unmute yourself first because we cannot hear you.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. I think Professor Higashi has made a very insightful analysis of two factors in particular, the inclusivity and the flexibility in terms of his examination of conflicts in several countries, particularly South Sudan and Afghanistan, as well as Timor-Leste and so forth. I think his assertion that inclusivity is a key to finding the settlement among the parties in the conflict. At the same time, I think this flexibility is a difficult one because what it demands is not just to include the parties in the conflict, be they within the country or neighboring countries, and also global powers. I think flexibility, by that I mean the ability to understand each other very well. As you remember, the Chinese philosopher Sun Tzu, about 500 years before Christ, he wrote a book called The Art of War. And the best general is the one who wins the war without engaging in armed conflict. Now, how can you do that? I think you should know your enemy as well as yourself. And I think often what happens is that we think we know ourselves, but yet we don't so much. One of the problems that we have encountered in not being able to prevent this war in Ukraine is our inability to understand what was and is in the mind of Putin. And also, we didn't know. I think even the President Zelensky did not know how the United States and the European partners, they would react to Putin's or the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Had we known what the Putin had in mind, perhaps we would have done differently. Of course, John Mearsheimer and other realists, they have made their own analysis on that. So I would like to just turn to what the President Zelensky was saying or asking the Security Council just yesterday. You remember the people applauded him very much when he said to the Security Council members, look, Security Council is bankrupt. You could not prevent this war, and you are not able to even stop it. So he called upon Japanese lawmakers as well as Security Council members to reinvent the Security Council and the international system. I think for that, there are two ways to go about. The one is to have a virtually unipolar system. We had it briefly for about 20 years after the end of Cold War. And I was SRCG then, and it was very clear what we are to pursue. That is the democratic state based on John Rawls' theory of justice that is written along the line of Immanuel Kant. Now, that era is gone. Now we have what Alexander Bent says, the world in anarchy. But yet you remember, Bent said that there is, in fact, a rule in an anarchic world. That is military power. So we are back in a way in John Hobbes, the Leviathan at work. So how do we go about? And I think what we can do is to reinvent, not to reinvent, but to rebuild, totally rebuild the United Nations Security Council along the line of two recognition. The one, to recognize who holds the power, be it military, economic, as well as ethical and other powers that we have. And I think the concentration of power in the P5, in fact, has bankrupted the United Nations Security Council. Now, of course, there is a suggestion that we just take a veto power away from P5. That won't solve the problem. And also, it won't solve the problem just to exclude Russia out of G20 or UN Human Rights Council. That happened just before the World War II. You remember, gradually the League of Nations disintegrated. So my suggestion is this: to recompose the Security Council, reflecting military, economic, and moral power that exists at a given time, be it the 2022 or 2030 or 2050 or even 100 years from now. And let me give you how we can do so now for the first 20 years. I think we should transform G20, legitimize it into the UN Security Council. G20 has 85% of military power, 80% of economic global GDP, and 70% of global population. You recognize that countries such as Turkey is playing a key role. And the G20 has all the countries in the coffee club, be they Mexico, Korea, Brazil, and so forth. So we do so by invoking Article 109 to convene the General Conference to review and amend the charter. It happened, you remember, in 1963, when the number of Security Council seats was increased from 11 to 15. It doesn't require the consent of all the G5s. We can initiate it. And the idea was approved by General Assembly, but rejected at first by Security Council P5s. But it took a year and a half for them to accept. So I propose that we do so first 10 years from now, keep the P5, including Russia, but give Russia 10 years of grace period. After the war in Ukraine, they have 10 years to resurrect themselves, to gain the trust of global community. And then we should have 10 members with 5 years. And what I suggest is this, to have not only the sovereign states, but the regional organizations such as EU, African Union, ACUNS, and so forth. They should be eligible for the membership in the 25-member Security Council. So with that, I think we can have 3 groups. Group 1A is 10 years, and Group B, 10 countries with 5 years, and Group C, 3 years renewable. In this way, I think we will have more representative Security Council, and they together can form the power to prevent and also stop the conflict. That I hope maybe we can, in fact, think for this, rebuilding the Security Council and to meet, to address what the President Zelensky was saying. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now let me give the floor to Andres Hereblinger.
Thank you, Sarah. And I'm afraid I do have to disrupt our reform efforts at the Security Council for a few more discussions or points about inclusion. I did have the pleasure to have a look at your book, Daisaku. Probably it's one of the first readers in Switzerland, but certainly not one of the last. I think it's a fascinating and timely book, and I'll really be speaking a little bit about inclusion and inclusivity now, because it is really also kind of at the heart of my previous research at the Graduate Institute. So I think we've seen quite a lot of research coming out on inclusion over the past decade or so, and I think particularly in the early days, much of that research has been quite quantitative. And in addition, we've also seen, obviously, with this topic, a lot of policy-driven research that very often, I think, bends the empirical picture so as to produce kind of neat, prescriptive and implementable knowledge. And I think it's also incredibly a kind of a difficult field of research, particularly, and I think Sarah points to that in her own research, because the inclusivity is very much shaped by the fact that it's not only something that can be observed, but that is something that is very much desired by many. It has a normative quality, right? At least in the part of the world from which we do our research. That said, I think in-depth case studies are very much necessary to really have a look at dynamics of inclusion, and particularly the trade-offs between kind of normative and pragmatic concerns. And I think, Daisaku, your book does exactly that. And I think that's why it's a very, very important contribution. And I do have to say, I've been quite fascinated by the levels of access that you had for your research, both to kind of high-level decision makers in international organizations, particularly the UN, as well as national elites. It's quite remarkable just even reading your acknowledgement section. I think every PhD student or postdoc will be very, very jealous, and probably people should reach out to you to get to have you teach a course on fieldwork access or field access. So I think, you know, your discussion of inclusivity very much kind of captures one of the major challenges that when it comes to mediated peace processes, and that is to really kind of, we have two opposing findings. First is that there's a risk that mediators might fail to establish a lasting peace if they only involve high-level military and political parties. And on the other hand, there's a risk that they do not achieve any peace at all if they aim to maximize inclusion, because they will there will be more and more demands. The negotiation table will get broader and impossible to handle. And rightly so, you do argue for a kind of a flexible approach as the solution. And so not only at aiming to implement kind of a normative framework, kind of in a tick box exercise, but in a situational way. And that this is obviously very appropriate. And I think it fits also very well with other research that has been emerging recently in the past years. And I just want to mention the research done by Berghoff Foundation, and particularly Véronique Dudoué, on incremental inclusion, which I think really sits very well with what you are describing. So just maybe 3 points from my end to kind of to think about the research looking forward on inclusivity and inclusion. The first is an effort, and I think Sarah can speak to this as well. By the way, Sarah, I mean, I know you're moderating, but I would welcome your remarks as well, particularly because I do notice that this panel is a little bit male dominated here. So be happy to, you know, have your very distinguished views on this here as well, as we're striving for inclusivity and diversity in also our research and academic debate. First of all, I think there is something to say about the link between inclusion and multi-track. And I think this is an underexplored research topic. So far, I think the research has kind of coexisted very much a bit in separation from each other. I think some of the inclusion study frameworks that have been advanced over the past years have been advanced maybe as a radical alternative to thinking like across tracks. But I don't think it is very helpful, because in fact, practitioners and policymakers do tend to think about like in a track logic as well. So really kind of looking at the interaction between multi-track and inclusivity approaches, I think is quite important, particularly asking about how they can reinforce each other, but also how they can create synergies, but also how they can do the opposite. And also actually I think there's quite a bit of research that could be done from a social constructivist IR point of view here, because it does occur to me that somehow we need inclusivity because we have a track logic in the first place. If we take for granted that elites are the ones who are doing peace deals, then of course we have to ask questions about inclusivity after. Maybe there's a kind of a broader systems picture and constructivist picture that we should really try to produce in order to challenge some of the pre-givens that in which we work when we study peace building or make peace, and that these pre-givens I think make peacemaking and peace building quite difficult at times. The second point that I want to raise is about making inclusion motives more visible, and I think that Daisaku speaks well again to this question of how to have a flexible approach. So in the research that I've done together with Dan and Landau just before we kind of concluded our inclusion adventures at the Graduate Institute a couple of years ago, I would argue that we argued that it's quite worthwhile to differentiate between various motives of inclusion, so you could call purposes of inclusion, or kind of the political strategies that underpin inclusion. And Daisaku, you point very much to the fact that inclusion is very often exercised or asked for to foster the legitimacy of processes and make processes more sustainable. But I think there are other motives as well, including the empowerment of women. A lot has happened around Security Council Resolution 2025, as well as other council resolutions, including the one on youth participation and so on. And if you actually look at the policy, that the international policy on inclusion that's out there, it does also intersect with calls for the protection of civilians and so on. So there's like various different kind of motives. And I think when we talk about flexible approaches, I think it's quite important to consider, in fact, how mediators, but also conflict parties and stakeholders think about inclusion and participation, what they try to achieve through asking for by asking for more inclusion or inclusive processes. And in that sense, I think what I'm trying to say here is that I think we need to find ways of politicizing inclusion. And I think very often it is seen as a merely technical exercise. Now we have like some manuals how to do this basically at the international level. But I think, in fact, what's needed is to think about how different calls for inclusion, varying calls for inclusions, are speaking of particular political commitments. And I think that is something that might be worthwhile bringing out a bit more in future research. And that brings me to my last point. Daisaku, you're mentioning the work by Charles Cole on political exclusion, and you say you very much agree with this argument that political exclusion is the major cause for the recurrence of armed conflict. I think there is ample qualitative and quantitative evidence that points to that today. But I think this also really points to the role of politics in political processes. And I mean, it's a bit bizarre to actually say this like that because it seems so obvious, but I think we tend to forget that when we talk about inclusivity and multi-track. So what I would really argue is that, and this is kind of very much coming from a perspective of an emerging literature on agonistic peace building, that the key concern with inclusion should be that it should be relational in the sense that it includes antagonists. It should include people or different views that speak of diverging views on the future political order, right? So bringing identities at the negotiation table, symbolically speaking, that have different ideas of how the country should be governed peacefully. And this, of course, might at first include or involve the inclusion of the major conflict parties and those that can wreak most havoc. But then, of course, there are many other agonistic relationships in society, including between majority and minority populations, religious group, ideological movements, the youth, the elderly, feminists, and the patriarchy, and so on. And I think that might be actually an innovative way of furthering that research on inclusion. I have other things to say on the regional and the international governance peace architecture, but I think I'm over time. Just to say, I think that this is of course a very important contribution that you made there as well when it comes to discussing both how international organizations, will regional organizations play a major role in peacemaking efforts? Of course, the current political situation which we find ourselves asks big questions about, what's coming next, and how, if at all, are we still able to multilaterally mandate peace operations in the future. But let me shut up, and I hope we'll get a few more voices into the virtual room. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andreas, for raising these important points. I would now like to give the floor actually to all of you. So if you have any questions, any comments, please just raise your hand. There should be the raise hand function on your Zoom under reactions. And if you take the floor, I would just like to ask you to maybe briefly state your name and your affiliation if possible. Perfect. We already have one question, Mr. Akio Nakayama. Please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. Actually, I just want to share some comments because Professor Hazakawa, prior to this seminar, just suggested me to make some contributions. So just I'll be very, very brief because, first of all, thank you very much for Dr. Higashi for such a comprehensive and stimulating presentation, and also valuable comments from Professor Hazakawa and also Andreas. So I'll be very brief because I was, until recently, work in Myanmar as IOM's country director. So I'd like to share some view, perhaps that provides some additional piece to this important discussion. That is really a significant role of social cohesion and trust building, because these are really essential conditions for promoting sustainable peace and any kind of inclusive peace process. In other words, lack of social cohesion, there's social divisions, and lack of trust, mistrust are the major root causes of the conflict, and that really major hindrance of inclusive political process. So, and also I completely agree with Dr. Higashi about the critical role of great powers and neighboring countries for brokering peace. And that is, among others, very relevant for the situation on Myanmar. Clearly, its neighboring countries and great powers should have a major role for bringing democracy back in Myanmar, or at least starting the political process in Myanmar. But I'd like to refer to also another important implication, that is the role of community-based approach for social cohesion and trust building. And there's some moderate success under the NLD government before the coup for promoting that kind of dialogue, mainly focusing on durable solution of IDP. And of course, that is a combination of several factors, but one factor is significant contribution made by late Dr. Kofi Annan through his recommendations. One of his key recommendations is the promotion of durable solution. And also international community generally responded very actively, like Swiss government. They provided leading international experts, Professor Walter Kaelin, who is known as a leading expert of IDP and human rights. And he literally worked with the Myanmar government and counterparts and the UN for the development of strategy for durable solution. Because that is before the coup, so the political context has completely changed. But my point is still those community-based organizations maintain significant experience for years of trust buildings. Unfortunately, they're facing serious security risk and lack of political framework for continuing their activity, but potentials are there. So by promoting the inclusive dialogue in Myanmar, there is a way to bring back some elements of this previous retested community-based and trust-building approach. But then I want back to the point made by Professor Hasegawa, because when we are sitting in the UN country team in Myanmar, always repeated requests and perhaps frustrations expressed by many members is the lack of strong political support from the Security Council. And without it, there's no way to really promote all-inclusive dialogue, particularly now under the military regime, even more that kind of, but the current, the status of Security Council is not really conducive for playing that kind of role. So that brings us back to this core question of what is a global governance that could enable the inclusive, genuinely inclusive peace process. So that's my brief comment. Over.
Thank you very much for this comment. Sveta.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Super. So mine are just very brief questions. First of all, thank you so much for the presentation. I'm Shweta and I'm a PhD student at the Graduate Institute. Very interesting presentation. So my first question is, I think when we discuss about inclusion, I immediately get to the question of inclusion from whose perspective are we talking about? Is this from the perspective of the Western powers who are leading the negotiation process? Is it from the conflict parties themselves? Sorry. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on whose inclusion we're debating here, essentially. And second is, I also wanted to draw some attention to the question of norms and values, which are sort of very difficult to disentangle from this larger process, because I guess the dominant norms or values determine who even gets a seat on the table. And I think this was very evident in Afghanistan's case, where there was a lot of debate about whether or not Taliban should be at the table or not because of their label as a terrorist organization. So I'd also be curious to hear your thoughts on this, and what's your take on different non-state actors having a seat at the table legitimately in that sense? Thank you.
Thank you very much for these questions. Before giving the floor back to Daisaku, let me just maybe also add some reflections, just also listening to the conversation. So I'm stepping out quickly of my role as a chair, and I add some comments. And while listening to your book presentation as well, I was reminded again really of the importance of defining clearly what we mean by inclusion. I think it really has become a buzzword that is very appealing to policymakers. But if we are not really clear about what we mean by it, we also risk of kind of it being instrumentalized and in the end being watered down to just a buzzword without actually containing the meaning that we actually want for it. So the questions of what does inclusion really mean and for whom, and this relates to Sveta's questions, I think is important. A second comment, and this relates to Andreas' comment, is really this need to repoliticize inclusion. And I think you do this very well in your book. Inclusion, be it of civil society actors or of excluded armed groups, is not a technical exercise. It's really a deeply political exercise. We're including actors with deeply political relations. And if we don't repoliticize this, I think we risk also of essentializing actors group, and it becomes kind of some of the interlocutors I spoke with in the Syria peace process. They said, it becomes just a head counting exercise, and we're putting people into groups they may not necessarily be happy with being put, or we're essentializing basically identities, whereas identities are of course relationally constructed and also of a very variable geometry. So here I sympathize a lot with your flexible approach to inclusion. And a third and a second last comment, I think what I was also impressed by is actually your access. And if I understand correctly, most of your interlocutors are high-ranking diplomats and political elites. And I was wondering whether you think that your research or the outcomes of your research would actually change if you spoke more with maybe civil society actors or other groups, maybe not at the kind of political elite level. Because I also think what we are still actually deeply missing in research on inclusion is basically the perspectives of the included or the excluded. Usually when we see kind of research on rationales or motivations or even modes of inclusion, it's always from the perspective of those who kind of have the power to decide on whether or not to include, but not so much from the perspective of those who are actually potentially included or excluded. And then a final point which relates to Professor Sukehiro's comments. I think inclusion has really kind of been promoted as a norm or as an important value as part of the liberal paradigm or liberal peace-building approach. And one of the fundamental questions I think that we are facing now is, to what extent is inclusion still viable in a multipolar world order? What will happen to this norm of the liberal peace-building approach now that we have entered actually a new phase of international world politics? Just some reflections to add to your already very long list of questions and comments, Daisaku. I would like to give the floor back to you, maybe for some answers and reactions.
Thank you very much for your comment and the questions. Let me start responding to some of the questions that Sarah gave me, and then I will go back to the question from another participant. You mentioned about my study on the high-ranked official, but when I started my field research on peace building, I did a lot of research on the community-based analysis. So I started my research in East Timor and Afghanistan in 2008, and so this is a slide on that time. But yes, I interviewed a lot of ministers, but I also conducted opinion survey with almost 260 normal villagers in 3 different provinces in Afghanistan. Because it was extremely dangerous, even in 2008, to go to the local places. It was just impossible to interview the local people by myself, because I might be abducted by the insurgency, and they might request Japanese government to pay for a lot of ransom. So I went to the central part or provincial capital of each provinces, like Wardak, Kapisa, and Kandahar. And United Nations, UNAMA, and also local NGO kindly requested those villagers to gather in the central part of the province and responded to my questionnaire by using a local language like a Dari and the Pashtun languages. So I also joined those survey together with its translator, so that I could hear the voice of the very local or normal peoples in the local village in the 3 different provinces. And that gave me really, really important suggestions and also insight. And also in terms of the opinion survey, 90–80% of the people in Pashtun area, and also almost 86% of the people in Dari, not Dari, but Pashtun and the Tajik people responded that its only way for making a peace in Afghanistan is to pursue the political reconciliation with the Taliban. Even in terms of the coalition government between the Karzai at that time and the Taliban, 90–80% of the people responded in the Pashtun areas supported that kind of coalitions government, and the 69% of the Tajik people in Kapisa also supported that kind of idea. So, and I did this kind of same opinion survey in 3 different places in the East Timor with 320 normal villagers. So that was actually gave me a lot of insight, not confidence, but some idea about how normal people actually feel the necessity of the political reconciliation or political inclusions with like an insurgent group. So I always believe that this kind of approach is very important. But this was a research that I did as a PhD candidate at the University of British Columbia. So first, UBC gave me a lot of freedom to go to those conflicting areas. Now I belong to the Japanese institution, so it's become very difficult to get permission from Japanese university to go to those conflicting areas, because the government of Japan really prohibited Japanese to go to those places. So almost only option that I had is to get kind of an assignment from Japanese foreign minister to go to like Iraq and South Sudan, so that I can formally visit those places to conduct some interview. But in these cases, it's not so easy to conduct opinion survey or to have a communication with the local people. So at least I try to make a lot of lectures in the university and also community, so that I can have some exchange with a voice from like a student or professors. But yes, there's some limits. So I always hope that I can do some opinion survey, even in the refugee camps, like Syrian refugee in the Lebanon, or refugee camp in Uganda, about South Sudan. But it also requires a lot of the time and the commitments. I have a mind of making commitment, but after you start becoming a professor in the university, you need to teach out of the courses, so you have some limit of the time. So that was a challenge I faced, but I fully agree with Sarah's assessment that it's so crucial for us to hear the mind and the voice of the people if we want to have a research about inclusivity or legitimacy, because in the end of the day, we are talking about inclusivity, or how people actually accept inclusion of some specific political group, including some kind of former enemy as well. So this is something that I wanted to respond to use. In terms of the, if I can go back to the Swetha's question, who should be included or not, this is actually very complicated because different people use the language of inclusivity for different meanings. In my case, in terms of the post-conflict peace building, it's pretty much about who can or should be included in the nation building process as a national actor. So, and my approach, and it's also about related to the second question that Sveta can give me, because it's about norm and value, right? And the who could be included or not. My approach is that it's very dangerous to make a pre-assessment about character of the insurgency or political groups without having a dialogue. There's a famous Scott the theory that political spoilers theory, right? That you need to make a diagnosis about the spoilers. And if they are total spoiler, you should exclude it. If you are like a legitimate or limited or greedy spoiler, you should make effort to include them into the nation building process. But I think it's very dangerous to make an assessment about some group without having any political discussion. For example, I wrote very detailed in the chapter 4 in my book about Afghanistan, that Taliban actually approached to the Karzai government many times in 2002 and 2003 that they are ready to participate in the nation building process. Some Mutawakil, former foreign minister of Taliban, proposed that he's ready to make a political party of the Taliban so that he can invite a lot of high-rank officials of the Taliban to come to this political party. So CIA officer sent the cable to the Vice President Cheney whether or not it's okay to start having this kind of process of making a political party of the Taliban in 2002. But the response from Washington, D.C. was that no, you should destroy the Taliban. 20 years later, so Taliban had almost one option that they should be regrouped and start making a military insurgency in about 2004, 2005. So UN Special Envoy for Afghanistan, Mr. Brahimi, continued to argue that it was one of the biggest mistakes for him and for the international community to not try to include the Taliban into the nation building process in like a 2002 or 2003. So my approach is that it's important to at least to make an effort to include almost all political group and military group into the nation building first, as long as they denounce the violence and they can, comply with the, like a basic peace agreement framework. And of course, in the end of the day, there might be some group which will refuse entering any nation building process. For example, Islamic State in Iraq or Syria was very difficult to be included. It's not because of character, but they refuse it. So those are my approach. Of course, there might be some reality. Some group might not be, in the end of the day, they might refuse it. But it's very important for the peace building side to try to make a inclusion as much as possible. I'm sure there's a lot of opposition, but this is my position, that because I tend to prioritize making a peace first, and then maybe accountability will come later. So Maybe I hope I can. I could respond to that question with Swesa. In terms of mediation during armed conflict, yes, inclusivity need to be flexible. So you might need to choose some influential group from in terms of fighting group or conflicting parties. In terms of the global power or neighboring state, they need to be positive. They need to play the positive role in stopping the war. And otherwise, it might be very counterproductive that those countries actually become involved in the peace negotiations. So that was kind of reality that we need to think about. So yeah, when we are now thinking about how to stop the war in the Ukraine, yeah, there's no doubt that China has a lot of the leverage against Russia. But if China does not make a mind to stop the war, it might not be so productive that China will be involved. So this we need to have some practical approach, I think. In terms of the Andreas' comment, I really appreciate you gave me a lot of the comment and the very, very, very nice word about my book. One comment that you gave, I would like to respond to one comment that you gave me. It's about Charles Cole's books. Yes, in retrospect, but where the researcher now, like you and me and Sarah, who live in 2022, it looks so natural, right? That we need to respect the inclusive political process. But 15 years ago, we did not have so much narrative about how inclusion might be important. Actually, it's very natural to focus on the counter-insurgency strategies. And the counter-strategy strategy really focus on making a heart and mind. It's basically about how to make a police in the military and also create the money to get the hearts of the people on the ground. So they are not talking so much about the importance of the political inclusion. So at least in the normative side, we got more and more awareness that how this issue is important, and this is an important progress, I think. But at the same time, I was a little bit worried that the world of the inclusivity if the world of the inclusivity become too dogmatic, it might actually make it difficult for some mediators to make a peace agreement at first place. So this is something that I wanted to propose through this book, that yes, inclusion is very important, both in the mediation and peace building, but in terms of the inclusion in the mediations, you might need to take some practical and flexible approach. And I appreciate that Sarah at least show some sympathy about importance of the flexibility on the mediation. So yeah, I'm not sure I responded to all the questions, but let me stop here.
Great, thank you very much. We actually have one more question by Dr. Sonu Bashkar. Please, the floor is yours. We don't have so much time left, so if you could keep it short, I would appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah, and great to hear this very interesting presentation. Greetings from Sydney. And my question is that, I'm a Rotarian and I sit on the board of Rotary, and I often see that the great efforts in peace building are often get demoralized because of sincere, involvement with the grassroots, community and opinion leaders. So what do we do in terms of decolonizing our peace building agenda? How do we decolonize our outreach, which is really sincere and is driven by impact rather than agendas, which often tend to have economic and political interest? Thanks.
Thank you very much. And one more comment from Mohammed.
Hello, thank you, Sarah. Thank you for the presentation. Which very briefly, I'm Mohammed Hassan. I'm holding a PhD on constitutional law about the federal system in Iraq. So my question is about Iraq. We saw some nice picture with some Iraqi leaders, So my question is, after 18 years, the end of the regime of Saddam, now we see the big picture of Iraq. They cannot find the stability and the peace today, you know, after all these years and the end of a dictatorial regime. So is there any chance for a mediation now, or a solution or stability? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Daisaku, I would like to give you the floor. Again, we're already out of time, but I would like you to kind of respond to those two very important questions and then maybe make some kind of final conclusionary statements.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you very much for great questions. Yeah, decolonized, yeah. I'm sorry that I might not be able to give a very holistic response, but one of the important step or suggestion that I might be able to make is that international organizations and the local government need to make every effort to hear and gather, or to have a understanding of the opinion and the voices of the local people through some surveys, community discussion, group interview, those kind of stuff. Because in many cases, we have a lack of that kind of effort. When I was in the UNAMA, we did not have so much systematic research or survey about capturing this perception of the local peoples. I was able to do it when I was a researcher, academic researcher, but once I started working in UNAMA, it became very politically difficult, but if you are civilian officers, it might be necessary to do it, right? And this is one of the important process to get peace negotiation to have some legitimacy by hearing the voice of the people. So when there was a peace negotiation in Colombia, at least it was a very bilateral negotiation between the Colombian government and the FARC, but at least the United Nations played a big role to gather the voice of the local people in making a lot of the dialogue conference, and they created some paper and they give the input to those negotiation team in Havana in the process of the negotiation. So that kind of the approach to make every effort to hear the voice of the local people and to make some systematic approach and information and give the input to the conflicting party or negotiation partner might be quite important. And we tend to forget about doing that kind of stuff. And maybe academic researcher might be able to make some contribution to those kind of steps. In terms of Mohammed Hassan's question, it's a huge question, big question. In theory, it's very difficult to make a stability if only Shia political party continue to dominate the power. So, for example, some of the vice president told me that it's important to make some national party, several national parties, which have, Shia, Sunni, and Kurd, so that they will make a competitions, not by the sect of the religion, but by the policies. And once you establish that kind of political environment, it might become at least theoretically possible to make some kind of political coexistence and reconciliations. But yeah, it's easy to say, but in the reality, it's not so easy. But yeah, I keep hoping that Iraqi people will find some way. But this will go back to some original question of the Sarah about liberal peace building theory, because we had an assumption that we will create a democratic regime, right, in the aftermath of the conflict, but some state might start choosing some kind of a non-democratic governance, at least for first 10 years, 20 years, to make some stabilities. When Japan modernized Japan 120 years ago, we chose not to have a democratic system for 20 years to make a local government, central government. So and Taliban also maybe will choose not a democratic state for 10, 15, 20 years, but they might want to have stability first. I mean, Afghan people might want to have a stability at first and survival. So we might need to have some kind of flexibility on the governance question as well.